Part 1. The Wildlands. Chapter 1. I did not go to Ethelfled's funeral. She was buried in Gloucester in the same vault as her husband, whom she hated. Her brother, King Edward of Wessex, was chief mourner, and when the rites were done and Ethelfled's corpse had been walled up, he stayed in Gloucester. His sister's strange banner of the Holy Goose was lowered over the palace, and the Dragon of Wessex was hoisted in its place. The message could not have been plainer. Mercia no longer existed. In all the British lands south of Northumbria and east of Wales, there was only one kingdom and one king. Edward sent me a summons, demanding I travel to Gloucester and swear fealty to him for the lands I owned in what had been Mercia, and the summons bore his name followed by the words Anglorum Saxonum Rex, King of the Angles and the Saxons. I ignored the document. Within a year, a second document reached me, this one signed and sealed in Wintoncester. By the grace of God, it told me, the lands granted to me by Ethelfled of Mercia were now forfeited to the bishopric of Hereford, which, the parchment assured me, would employ said lands to the furtherance of God's glory. Meaning, Bishop Wulfred will have more silver to spend on his whores, I told Edith. Maybe you should have gone to Gloucester, she suggested. And swear loyalty to Edward? I spat the name. Never. I don't need Wessex, and Wessex doesn't need me. So, what will you do about the estates? She asked. Nothing, I said. What could I do? Go to war against Wessex? It annoyed me that Bishop Wulfred, an old enemy, had taken the land, but I had no need of Mercian lands. I owned Bebbanburg. I was a Northumbrian lord, and owned all that I wanted. Why should I do anything? I growled at Edith. I'm old and I don't need trouble. You're not old, she said loyally. I'm old, I insisted. I was over 60. I was ancient. You don't look old. So Wulfred can plough his whores and let me die in peace. I don't care if I never see Wessex or Mercia ever again. Yet a year later I was in Mercia, mounted on Tintrig, my fiercest stallion, and wearing a helmet and mail, and with serpent breath my sword slung at my left hip. Rorick, my servant, carried my heavy iron-rimmed shield, and behind us were 90 men, all armed, and all mounted on war horses. Sweet Jesus, Finnan said beside me. He was gazing at the enemy in the valley beneath us. 400 of the bastards. He paused. At least 400, maybe 5. I said nothing. It was late on a winter's afternoon, and bitterly cold. The horse's breath misted among the leafless trees that crowned the gentle ridge from where we watched our enemy. The sun was sinking and hidden by clouds, which meant no betraying sparks of light could be reflected from our mail or weapons. Away to my right, to the west, the River Dee lay flat and grey as it widened towards the sea. On the lower ground in front of us was the enemy, and beyond them, Chester. 500, Finnan decided. I never thought I'd see this place again, I said. Never wanted to see it again. They broke the bridge, Finnan said, peering far to the south. Wouldn't you, in their place? The place was Chester, and our enemy was besieging the city. Most of that enemy was to the east of the city, but smoking campfires betrayed plenty to the city's north. The River Dee flowed just south of the city walls, then turned north towards its widening estuary, and by breaking the central span of the ancient Roman bridge, the enemy had ensured that no relief force could come from the south. If the city's small garrison was to fight its way out of the trap, they would need to come north or east, where the enemy was strongest. And that garrison was small. I had been told, though it was nothing more than a guess, that fewer than 100 men held the city. Finnan must have been thinking the same thing. And 500 men couldn't take the city, he said derisively. Nearer 600, I suggested mildly. It was hard to estimate the enemy because many of the folk in the besiegers' encampment were women and children, but I thought Finnan's guess was low. Tintrigg lowered his head and snorted. I patted his neck, then touched Serpent Breath's hilt for luck. I wouldn't want to assault those walls, I said. Chester's stone walls had been built by the Romans, and the Romans had built well. And the city's small garrison, I thought, had been well led. They had repelled the early assaults, and so the enemy had settled down to starve them out. So, what do we do? Finnan asked. Well, we've come a long way, I said. So? So, it seems a pity not to fight. I gazed at the city. If what we were told is true, then the poor bastards in the city will be eating rats by now. And that lot? I nodded down to the campfires. They're cold, they're bored, and they've been here too long. They've got blooded when they attacked the walls, so now they're just waiting. I could see the thick barricades that the besiegers had made outside Chester's northern and eastern gates. Those barricades would be guarded by the enemy's best troops, posted there to stop the garrison sallying out or trying to escape. They're cold, I said again. They're bored, and they're useless. Finnan smiled. Useless? They're mostly from the Fyrd, I said. The Fyrd is an army raised from field labourers, shepherds, common men. They might be brave, but a trained house warrior like the 90 who followed me was far more lethal. Useless, I said again, and stupid. Stupid? Berg, mounted on his stallion behind me, asked. No sentries out here. They should never have let us get this close. They have no idea we're here, and stupidity gets you killed. I like that they're stupid, Berg said. He was a Norseman, young and savage, frightened of nothing except the disapproval of his young Saxon wife. 3 hours to sunset? Finnan suggested. Let's not waste them. I turned Tintrigg, going back through the trees to the road that led to Chester from the ford of the Mersey. The road brought back memories of riding to face Ragnall and of Haston's death, and now the road was leading me towards another fight. Though we looked anything but threatening as we rode down the long, gentle slope, we did not hurry. We came like men who were finishing a long journey, which was true, and we kept our swords in their scabbards and our spears bundled on the pack horses led by our servants. The enemy must have seen us almost as soon as we emerged from the wooded ridge, but we were few and they were many, and our ambling approach suggested we came in peace. The high stone wall of the city was in shadow, but I could make out the banners hanging from the ramparts. They showed Christian crosses, and I remembered Bishop Leofston, a holy fool and a good man, who had been chosen as Chester's bishop by Ethelfled. She had strengthened and garrisoned the city fort as a bulwark against the Norse and Danes who crossed the Irish Sea to hunt for slaves in the Saxon lands. Ethelfled, Alfred's daughter, and ruler of Mercia. Dead now. Her corpse was decaying in a cold stone vault. I imagined her dead hands clutching a crucifix in the grave's foul darkness, and remembered those same hands clawing my spine as she writhed beneath me. God forgive me, she would say, don't stop. And now she had brought me back to Chester, and Serpent Breath was about to kill again. Ethelfled's brother ruled Wessex. He had been content to let his sister rule Mercia, but on her death he had marched West Saxon troops north across the Thames. They came, he said, to honour his sister at her funeral, but they stayed to impose Edward's rule on his sister's realm. Edward, Anglorum Saxonum Rex. Those Mercian lords who bent their knee were rewarded, but some, a few, resented the West Saxons. Mercia was a proud land. There had been a time when the King of Mercia was the most powerful ruler of Britain, when the kings of Wessex and of East Anglia and the chieftains of Wales had sent tribute, when Mercia was the largest of all the British kingdoms. Then the Danes had come, and Mercia had fallen, and it had been Ethelfled who had fought back, who had driven the pagans northwards and built the burhs that protected her frontier. And she was dead, mouldering, and her brother's troops now guarded the burh walls, and the King of Wessex called himself King of all the Saxons, and he demanded silver to pay for the garrisons, and he took land from the resentful lords and gave it to his own men, or to the church. Always to the church, because it was the priests who preached to the Mercian folk that it was their nailed god's will that Edward of Wessex be king in their land, and that to oppose the king was to oppose their god. Yet fear of the nailed god did not prevent a revolt, and so the fighting had begun. Saxon against Saxon, Christian against Christian, Mercian against Mercian, and Mercian against West Saxon. The rebels fought under Ethelfled's flag, declaring that it had been her will that her daughter, Elfwin, succeed her. Elfwin, Queen of Mercia. I liked Elfwin, but she could no more have ruled a kingdom than she could have speared a charging boar. She was flighty, frivolous, pretty, and petty. Edward, knowing his niece had been named to the throne, took care to have her shut away in a convent, along with his discarded wife, but still the rebels flaunted her mother's flag and fought in her name. They were led by Kinlaf Haraldsson, a West Saxon warrior whom Ethelfled had wanted as a husband for Elfwin. The truth, of course, was that Kinlaf wanted to be king of Mercia himself. He was young, he was handsome, he was brave in battle and, to my mind, stupid. His ambition was to defeat the West Saxons, rescue his bride from her convent, and be crowned. But first, he must capture Chester, and he had failed. "It feels like snow," Finan said as we rode south towards the city. "It's too late in the year for snow," I said confidently. "I can feel it in my bones," he said, shivering. "It'll come by nightfall." I scoffed at that. 2 shillings says it won't." He laughed. "God send me more fools with silver. My bones are never wrong." Finan was Irish, my second in command, and my dearest friend. His face, framed by the steel of his helmet, looked lined and old. His beard was grey. Mine was too, I suppose. I watched as he loosened Soul Stealer in her scabbard, and as his eyes flicked across the smoke of the campfires ahead. "So, what are we doing?" he asked. "Scouring the bastards off the eastern side of the city," I said. "They're thick there." I guessed that almost 2/3 of the enemy were camped on Chester's eastern flank. The campfires were dense there, burning between low shelters made of branches and turf. To the south of the crude shelters were a dozen lavish tents, placed close to the ruins of the old Roman arena, which, even though it had been used as a convenient quarry, still rose higher than the tents above which 2 flags hung motionless in the still air. "If Kinlaf's still here," I said, "he'll be in one of those tents." "Let's hope the bastard's drunk." "Or else he's in the arena," I said. The arena was built just outside the city and was a vast hulk of stone. Beneath its banked stone seating were cave-like rooms that, when I had last explored them, were home to wild dogs. "If he had any sense," I went on, "he'd have abandoned this siege, left men to keep the garrison starving and gone south. That's where the rebellion will be won or lost, not here." "Does he have sense?" "Daft as a turnip," I said, and then started laughing. A group of women burdened with firewood had stepped off the road to kneel as we passed, and they looked up at me in astonishment. I waved at them. "We're about to make some of them widows," I said, still laughing. "And that's funny." I spurred Tintrig into a trot. "What's funny," I said, "is that we're 2 old men riding to war." "You, maybe," Finan said pointedly. "You're my age. I'm not a grandfather." "You might be. You don't know. Bastards don't count." "They do," I insisted. "Then you're probably a great-grandfather by now." I gave him a harsh look. "Bastards don't count," I snarled, making him laugh. Then he made the sign of the cross because we had reached the Roman cemetery that stretched either side of the road. There were ghosts here. Ghosts wandering between the lichen-covered stones with their fading inscriptions that only Christian priests who understood Latin could read. Years before, in a fit of zeal, a priest had started throwing down the stones, declaring they were pagan abominations. That very same day he was struck down dead, and ever since the Christians had tolerated the graves, which I thought must be protected by the Roman gods. Bishop Leofston had laughed when I told him that story, and had assured me that the Romans were good Christians. "It was our God, the one true God, who slew the priest," he had told me. Then Leofston himself had died, struck down just as suddenly as the grave-hating priest. Weird bith full arad. My men were strung out now, not quite in single file, but close. None wanted to ride too near the road's verges because that was where the ghosts gathered. The long, straggling line of horsemen made us vulnerable, but the enemy seemed oblivious to our threat. We passed more women, all bent beneath great burdens of firewood they had cut from spinneys north of the graves. The nearest campfires were close now. The afternoon's light was fading, though dusk was still an hour or more away. I could see men on the northern city wall, see their spears, and knew they must be watching us. They would think we were reinforcements, come to help the besiegers. I curbed Tintrigg just beyond the old Roman cemetery to let my men catch up. The sight of the graves and thinking of Bishop Leofston had brought back memories. "Remember Muss?" I asked Finnan. "Christ, how could anyone forget her?" he grinned. "Did you?" he began. "Never. You?" He shook his head. "Your son gave her a few good rides." I had left my son in command of the troops garrisoning Bebbanburg. "He's a lucky boy," I said. Muss, her real name was Sungifu, was small like a mouse, and had been married to Bishop Leofston. "I wonder where Muss is now?" I asked. I was still gazing at Chester's northern wall, trying to estimate how many men stood guard on the ramparts. "More than I expected," I said. "More?" "Men on the wall," I explained. I could see at least 40 men on the ramparts, and knew there must be just as many on the eastern wall, which faced the bulk of the enemy. "Maybe they were reinforced?" Finnan suggested. Or the monk was wrong, which wouldn't surprise me. A monk had come to Bebbanburg with news of Chester's siege. We already knew of the Mercian rebellion, of course, and we had welcomed it. It was no secret that Edward, who now styled himself King of the Angles and Saxons, wanted to invade Northumbria, and so make that arrogant title come true. Sigtryggr, my son-in-law and King of Northumbria, had been preparing for that invasion, fearing it too, and then came the news that Mercia was tearing itself apart, and that Edward, far from invading us, was fighting to hold on to his new lands. Our response was obvious. Do nothing. Let Edward's realm tear itself into shreds, because every Saxon warrior who died in Mercia was one less man to bring a sword into Northumbria. Yet here I was, on a late winter's afternoon beneath a darkening sky, coming to fight in Mercia. Sigtryggr had not been happy, and his wife, my daughter, even unhappier. "Why?" she had demanded. "I took an oath," I'd told them both, and that had stilled their protests. Oaths are sacred. To break an oath is to invite the anger of the gods, and Sigtryggr had reluctantly agreed to let me relieve the siege of Chester. Not that he could have done much to stop me. I was his most powerful lord, his father-in-law, and the Lord of Bebbanburg. Indeed, he owed me his kingdom, but he insisted I take fewer than 100 warriors. "Take more," he had said, "and the damned Scots will come over the frontier." I had agreed. I led just 90 men, and with those 90 I intended to save King Edward's new kingdom. You think Edward will be grateful? My daughter had asked, trying to find some good news in my perverse decision. She was thinking that Edward's gratitude might persuade him to abandon his plans to invade Northumbria. Edward will think I'm a fool. You are, Stiora had said. Besides, I hear he's sick. Good, she had said vengefully. Maybe his new wife has worn him out. Edward would not be grateful, I thought, whatever happened here. Our horses' hooves were loud on the Roman road. We still rode slowly, showing no threat. We passed the old worn stone pillar that said it was 1 mile to Deva, the name the Romans had given Chester. By now we were among the hovels and campfires of the encampment, and folk watched us pass. They showed no alarm, there were no sentries, and no one challenged us. "What's wrong with them?" Finnan growled at me. "They think that if relief comes," I said, "it'll come from the east, not the north, so they think we're on their side." "Then they're idiots," he said. He was right, of course. Kinlath, if he still commanded here, should have sentries posted on every approach to the besiegers' camp, but the long, cold weeks of the siege had made them lazy and careless. Kinlath just wanted to capture Chester, and had forgotten to watch his back. Finnan, who had the eyes of a hawk, was gazing at the city wall. "That monk was full of shit," he said scornfully. "I can see 58 men on the north wall." The monk who had brought me the news of the siege had been certain that the garrison was perilously small. "How small?" I had asked him. "No more than 100 men, Lord." I had looked at him sceptically. "How do you know?" "The priest told me, Lord," he said nervously. The monk, who was called Brother Osric, claimed to be from a monastery in White, a place I had never heard of, but which the monk said was a few hours' walking south of Chester. Brother Osric had told us how a priest had come to his monastery. "He was dying, Lord. He had gripe in his guts." "And that was Father Swithred?" "Yes, Lord." I knew Swithred. He was an older man, a fierce and sour priest who disliked me. And the garrison sent him to get help. "Yes, Lord." "They didn't send a warrior?" "A priest can go where warriors cannot, Lord," Brother Osric had explained. "Father Swithred said he left the city at nightfall and walked through the besiegers' camp. No one challenged him, Lord. Then he walked south to White." "Where he was taken ill?" "Where he was dying as I left, Lord." Brother Osric had made the sign of the cross. "It is God's will." "Your God has a strange will," I had snarled. "And Father Swithred begged my abbot to send one of us to reach you, Lord," Brother Osric had continued, "and that was me." He finished lamely. He had been kneeling in supplication, and I saw a savage red scar crossing his tonsure. "Father Swithred doesn't like me," I said, "and he hates all pagans. Yet he sent for me." The question had made Brother Osric uncomfortable. He had blushed, then stammered. He insulted me," I suggested. "He did, Lord, he did." He sounded relieved that I had anticipated an answer he had been reluctant to say aloud. "But he also said you would answer the garrison's plea." "And Father Swithred didn't carry a letter?" I asked. "A plea for help?" "He did, Lord, but he vomited on it." He had grimaced. "But it was nasty, Lord, all blood and bile." "How did you get the scar?" I had asked him. "My sister hit me, Lord." He had sounded surprised at my question. "With a reaping hook, Lord." "And how many men in the besieging force?" "Father Swithred said there were hundreds, Lord." I remember how nervous Brother Osric had been, but I put that down to his fear at meeting me, a famous pagan. Did he think I had horns and a forked tail? "By God's grace, Lord," he went on, "the garrison fought off one assault, and I pray to God that the city hasn't fallen by now. They beseech your help, Lord." "Why hasn't Edward helped?" "He has other enemies, Lord. He's fighting them in southern Mercia." The monk had looked up beseechingly. "Please, Lord, the garrison can't last long." Yet they had lasted, and we had come. We had left the road by now, and our horses walked slowly through the besiegers' encampment. The luckiest folk had found shelter in the farm buildings that had been made by the Romans. They were good stone buildings, though the long years had destroyed their roofs, which were now untidy heaps of thatch on beams, but most people were in crude shelters. Women were feeding the fires with newly gathered wood, readying to cook an evening meal. They seemed incurious about us. They saw my mail coat and silver-crested helmet, saw the silver ornaments on Tintrig's bridle, and so realized I was a lord and dutifully knelt as I passed, but none dared ask who we were. I halted in an open space to the northeast of the city. I gazed around, puzzled because I could see few horses. The besiegers must have horses. I'd planned to drive those horses away to prevent men using them to escape, as well as to capture the beasts to defray the costs of this winter journey, but I could see no more than a dozen. If there were no horses, then we had the advantage, and so I turned to Tintrig and walked him back through my men until I reached the pack horses. "Unbundle the spears," I ordered the boys. There were 8 heavy bundles tied with leather ropes. Each spear was about 7 feet long, with an ash shaft and a sharpened steel blade. I waited as the bundles were untied, and as each of my men took one of the weapons. Most also carried a shield, but a few preferred to ride without the heavy willow boards. The enemy had let us come into the centre of their encampment, and they must have seen my men taking their spears, yet still they did nothing except watch us dully. I waited for the boys to coil the leather ropes, then climbed back into their saddles. "You boys," I called to the servants, "ride east, wait out in the fields till we send for you. Not you, Rorik." Rorik was my servant. A good boy. He was Norse. I had killed his father, captured the boy, and now treated him like a son, just as Ragnar the Dane had treated me as a son after his forces had cut my father down in battle. "Not me, lord?" he asked. "You follow me," I told him, "and have the horn ready. Stay behind me, and you don't need that spear." He pulled the spear out of my reach. "It's a spare one for you, lord," he said. He was lying, of course. He could not wait to use the weapon. "Don't get yourself killed, you idiot," I growled at him, then waited to see that the boys and the pack horses were safe beyond the encampment's edge. "You know what to do," I called to my men. "So do it." And it began. We spread into a line. We spurred forward. Smoke from the campfires was acrid. A dog barked. A child cried. 3 ravens flew eastwards, wings dark against grey clouds, and I wondered if they were an omen. I touched spurs to Tintrig's flanks, and he leaped forward. Finan was on my right, Berg on my left. I knew they were both protecting me, and I resented that. Old I might be, but weak, no. I lowered the spear point, nudged Tintrig with a knee, then leaned from the saddle and let the spear point slide into a man's shoulder. I felt the blade jar on bone, relax the thrust, and he turned with eyes full of pain and astonishment. I had not tried to kill him, just terrify. I rode past him, felt the blade jerk loose, swung the spear back, raised the blade, and watched the panic begin. Imagine you are cold, bored, and hungry. Maybe weak with sickness too, because the encampment stank of shit. Your leaders are telling you nothing but lies. If they have any idea how to end the siege short of waiting, they have not revealed it. And the cold goes on, day after day, a bone-biting chill, and there is never enough firewood, despite the women going every day to forage. You are told that the enemy is starving, but you are just as hungry. It rains. Some men slip away, trying to reach home with their wives and children, but the real warriors, the household troops who man the great barricades outside the city gates, patrol the eastward road. If they find a fugitive, he is dragged back, and if he's lucky, whipped bloody. His wife, if she is young, vanishes to the tents where the trained warriors live. All you can think of is home. And even though home is poor and your work in the fields is hard, It is better than this endless hunger and cold. You were promised victory and have been given misery. Then, on a late afternoon of lowering clouds, as the sun sinks in the west, the horsemen come. You see big horses carrying mail-clad men with long spears and sharp swords, helmeted men with wolf heads on their shields. The men are screaming at you. The thump of the big hooves is loud in the muck of the encampment. Your children are screaming and your women cowering, and the brightest thing in the winter afternoon is not the shine of the blades, not even the silver that crests their helmets, nor the gold hanging at the attackers' necks, but blood. Bright blood. Sudden blood. No wonder they panicked. We drove them like sheep. I had told my men to spare the women and children, even most of the men too, because I did not want my horsemen to stop. I wanted to see the enemy running and to keep them running. If we paused to kill, then we gave that enemy time to find their weapons, snatch up shields, and make a defence. It was better to gallop through the hovels and drive the enemy away from their piled shields, away from their spears, away from their reaping hooks and axes. The order was to strike and ride, strike and ride. We came to bring chaos, not death. Not yet. Death would come. And so we wheeled those big horses through the encampment, our hooves hurling up clods of mud, our spears sharp. If a man resisted, he died. If he ran, we made him run faster. I saw Folkbold, a huge Frisian, spear a flaming log from a campfire and toss it onto a shelter, and others of my men copied him. "Lord!" Finnan shouted to me. "Lord!" I turned to see he was pointing south to where men were running from the tents towards the clumsy barricade that faced the city's eastern gate. Those were the real warriors, the household troops. "Rorik!" I bellowed. "Rorik!" "Lord?" He was 20 paces away, turning his horse ready to pursue 3 men wearing leather jerkins and carrying axes. "Sound the horn!" He spurred towards me, curbing his horse as he fumbled with the long spear and tried to retrieve the horn that was slung on his back by a long cord. One of the 3 men, seeing Rorik's back turned, ran towards him with a raised axe. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but Finnan had seen the man, twisted his horse, spurred, and the man tried to run away. Soul Stealer flashed, her blade reflecting the flames of a fire, and the axeman's head rolled off. The body slewed along the ground, but the head bounced once, then landed in the fire, where the grease that the man had rubbed into his hair while cleaning his hands flared into sudden and bright flame. "Not bad for a grandfather," I said. "Bastards don't count, Lord," Finnan called back. Rorik blew the horn, blew it again, and kept blowing it, and the sound, so mournful, insistent, and loud, drew my horsemen back together. "Now, follow me!" I shouted. We had wounded the beast. Now we had to behead it.